As we mentioned, the radioactivity of carbon-14 halves every 5,730 years, meaning our diamond batteries have an incredible lifetime. They would only reach 50% power in the year 7746. These diamond batteries would therefore best be used in situations where it's not feasible to charge or replace conventional batteries, such as in satellites and space exploration, or use in implantable devices, such as pacemakers. In fact, there are so many possible applications that we're asking the public to make their own suggestions using the hashtag #DiamondBattery. The development of this new technology solves some of the problems of nuclear waste, clean electricity generation and battery life, truly taking us into the diamond age of power generation.
The course is designed to bring the very best scientists and engineers as undergraduates onto a disciplinary team specifically for problem solving for the nuclear industry.
This course will be appealing predominantly to physicists and engineers, but because of its general nature, it should be appealing to all of the sciences really, and this is the catchment that we're trying to get.
Bristol has an extremely well-recognised international reputation for physics and for science research and engineering in general. We have a long-standing track record of nuclear research over the last 25 years, and in 2013 we were ranked by the UK government.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Am I being mic'd? Is it coming through okay? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Jamie. Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm Rob Malkin. I'm a researcher here at the university. I work in the engineering department in mechanical engineering, and for the last 2 years I've been working closely with some Japanese partners on trying to use some sonar and some acoustic systems to help them in the problems that they face in Fukushima. But I thought today, this evening, I'd talk to you a little bit more about the background to the accident, what's going on there, and what the future might be like. So hopefully not too technical and lots of pictures. So when we think of Fukushima, what do we think about? Well, we probably think about nuclear power gone terribly wrong. We see some pictures of the plant which is blown up. It's the first thing probably comes to mind. Second thing we think about is the societal impact, protests around the world about nuclear power, Germany turning off all their nuclear reactors, a lot of discussions around whether we should have nuclear energy or not. We also think about the fact that large parts of the Fukushima area in Japan are out of bounds. You can't live there, can't work, can't travel. So that's another thing that is in our mind. And the last thing is some relatively distressing ideas of evacuation and people being forced from their homes. And I'd like to put all of these things into some kind of context so that you can all understand them a little bit better. The first thing I thought when Fukushima happened, the accident, I thought, well, if it can happen in Japan, it can happen anywhere. I mean, Japan is the home of robotics, the best civil infrastructure in the world. You know, consumer electronics, digital imaging, audio, visual systems, you know, Nobel Prize winners in optical communication, the world's first 3D printer. So surely this is a nation of people. I don't want to do that. Nation of highly advanced engineers and scientists. So, you know, what did go wrong and why did it go wrong? So what I'd like you to come away with this evening when you go home is an incredibly short overview of how nuclear energy works. Specifically, the type of nuclear energy employed at Fukushima during the time of the accident. What do you do to stop a nuclear reaction, and how do you try and maintain safety when you have to stop a nuclear reaction? the earthquake which happened in 2011, the tsunami which then came, and how that resulted in the loss of control of the sites. What happened afterwards in the first few days, weeks, and months after this said accident? What's it like at the moment? If you were to go there today, what would you see? Then I'm going to talk specifically about when we go inside the most radioactive, the most damaged parts of the site inside the cores. This talk isn't really going to cover too much of the environmental things outside of the site because it's not really my expertise. And lastly, I hope you have an overview of how it fits into context of the way that we produce energy in general. So why do we bother using nuclear energy in the first place? Well, it's incredibly efficient. One tiny little amount of uranium oxide fuel, about the size of a pencil rubber, is equivalent to a ton of coal with no CO2. If you compare all of the mining and transportation, it's still an incredibly energy efficient way of getting energy. How does it work? Well, you start off with a uranium atom, you hit it with a neutron, it becomes unstable. So again, not that there's anything wrong with nuclear energy, but it's just not as energy dense as nuclear. Okay, so to Japan. Japan just off the east coast of Korea, and it's divided into a number of prefectures, similar to counties. And this is Fukushima on the east coast, about the size of Northern Ireland, population and population density similar to Cornwall. It's mainly agriculture. And a lot of fish. Supposedly the best fish used to come from off the coast of Fukushima. And before 2011, it was a very, very large energy producer for the whole country. It contributed massively to the national grid. So in Fukushima itself, there's two nuclear sites. So Fukushima is the county, and you have Fukushima-Daichi, which is first, Fukushima-Daini, which means second. So when we talk about Fukushima, it's unfortunate that the state, the province, is called Fukushima and that the accident is referred to as Fukushima, because it's not quite fair, because you're going to have a big reputation problem for everybody who lives in Fukushima, even though the site could be hundreds of miles from them. So it's about 140 miles northwest of Tokyo, the biggest metropolitan city in the world, 42 million people. So very, very close, actually, to Tokyo itself. This is Fukushima-Daini. It was commissioned in 1982 for the nuclear engineers in the room. 4 boiling water reactors, 4.4 megawatts in total. And for context, Hinkley C is going to be about 3.3. So a pretty big site. Fukushima-Daini, it's about 10 kilometers to the north, commissioned in 71. The very first boiling water reactors ever made. And that's a little bit smaller in size. You can see from the aerial pictures, one is very different to the other, and at the end of this talk, you'll know exactly why. Now, if you had any faith in online reviews, this will end it forever. Fukushima gets 2.6 out of 5 stars. I don't know what you have to do to get a 1. I mean, if that doesn't do it, what will? Right. Okay. This is Fukushima-Daichi. This is what we'll be talking about, and I will refer to it just as Fukushima from now on. This is it in happier days. So 4 boiling water reactors, large seawall in front of it, and you can see here towards the north, this is where the water comes into the plant, and this is where the warmer water comes out. It's very close to the ocean, and you could say it's probably a bad design to put it so close to an ocean in an earthquake area, and it's easy to say that now, but at the time it met all of the regulations that the government imposed on them. So let's go into the nuclear core itself. It's a very old design, like I say. Should anybody in this room remember when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister? That's when this thing was designed. So to give you some idea of age, it's old. It's one of the first designs and quite complicated and not particularly safe. Inside the core, you'll find 9.5 million pellets, and those pellets sit inside rods. They're wrapped in a material called zirconium, and then they're bundled into a fuel bundle in the core. And that's really right in the middle there, and that core is about the size of a coach, something like that. Pretty small, a lot of energy. The reactor itself, a little bit bigger, and you can always tell it's a boiling water reactor because the control rods come in from the bottom. The fuel is sort of in the bottom third, and then you have steam dryers, which improve the quality of the steam before you take them to the turbines. And the control rods sit at the bottom, and we'll see a few more pictures of the control rods in a few slides. The other thing you have at a nuclear power plant is a spent fuel pool. So inside the reactor, you put in new fuel. It's in there for a couple of years. You get your money's worth out of it. Then the efficiency starts to drop. You remove it, and you put it into a spent fuel pool. And it sits there for a while because it's still very hot. So you have to keep cooling it for 5, 6 years, more sometimes. And then you will eventually remove it out of the building. And one of the issues with a spent fuel pool is that it's considered out of containment. It's in the reactor building, but it isn't shielded quite as much as the fuel within the reactor is. Last thing is you have this enormous crane which does all the operation. It refuels, it defuels, it moves heavy bits and bobs around. And for context, the size of it, this is me at a plant in Japan, very similar in design to Fukushima. And that's the top of the reactor there. So it's not particularly big, but you can power all of Bristol with it, and some. So this crane is going to come back, so it's good to have an idea of its size. The last thing is this big donut. It's called a suppression chamber at the bottom. This big donut is half full of water, and it's there to cope with very short losses in cooling. So if the core gets very hot temporarily, the steam is released into this donut, and you can tell the design. If you ever see the donut, it's a very, very early design of reactor. And there I am in the basement of one of these buildings, again, for size. And this is a mock-up that's currently being built in Japan to help with the cleanup. Last thing is the control rod area. It's in a place called the pedestal. This is me at the back and Professor Drinkwater. Some of you may know him. He's at the front there. Incredibly cramped, small area. And this is directly below the control rods, which will regularly be moving out of the core. Now, some of the pictures in this presentation are a little bit low quality, and that isn't because I'm lazy. It's because the company that releases some of these, because you're not allowed to take a camera to a site, they take pictures for you. They take them on a camera from 1950, probably. There's such low resolution, and it's mainly just to prevent the theft of industrial secrets. So if you see a low quality picture, it's not my fault. Right. So you have your reaction going. It's producing lots of lovely energy for you. You're generating electricity, and then something happens. You have an earthquake, or for some reason you need to stop the reaction very quickly. So what do? Well, the original way of doing it, this is Enrico Fermi in Chicago, and this is called the Chicago pile. This was a very early experimental reactor, and his way of stopping a reaction was to have a man with an axe and a rope. That was it. And he was called the Safety Control Rod Axe Man, or SCRAM. That's where the term SCRAM comes from. So he would drop his hand to say the reactions run away, and then the guy would cut the rope, and then a cadmium plate would fall into the reactor and stop the reaction. Not particularly quick, but it worked. Things are a little bit better these days. We've automated that process. So in Fukushima and in other nuclear sites, if there's an earthquake, that's automatically detected, and the control rods are inserted to stop the reaction very quickly. And you're about to see a video of one of these scrams happening. So, really quickly, a second or two at best, the reaction is essentially over now. However, there's still an awful lot of heat being generated by the fuel inside the reactor. So this is a graph of the temperature inside the core, and this is time in seconds from 0 to about a minute and a half. And the moment you insert the control rods, you reduce the temperature very, very quickly. However, not all of it. So after shutdown, you've got about 7%. 10 seconds later, you've got 7% of that heat remaining. And even a day and a half later, Only 0.5% of the reactor still, the heat that you used to produce when it was at full power. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but actually 15 megawatts is a lot of energy to try and absorb and deal with. And that's equivalent to about 8,000 kettles boiling. So a day and a half later, you have to somehow remove that quantity of heat. And usually the biggest problem with nuclear safety, if you do have some kind of an accident, is actually keeping the fuel cool, as we'll see in a second with what happened. I would absolutely love to tell you, and I really would, about all of the safety systems at Fukushima, and there's many, but I can't because we don't have time. If you want to know more, come and talk to me. I'd love to tell you. But they essentially have 5 jobs. First one is to keep the fuel cool, keep it below 1200 degrees Celsius. You don't want it to start to bend or warp. It's job number 1, probably the most difficult. Number 2, keep the cladding oxidization low. So the cladding is the material that you wrap around the fuel pellets, and you have to keep that oxidation down because when it oxidizes, it produces hydrogen, and we'll find out in a minute why that's bad. So yeah, if you do have oxidization, keep the hydrogen production relatively low. Maintain core integrity basically means don't let it melt, because if it melts, you can't cool it in the way that you would like to be able to cool it. And also have systems to allow for long-term cooling, because you have to cool it possibly for years. If you have complete loss of the control of the core, you might have to pump cold water in. Water is still being pumped into Fukushima to keep the reactors cool. So it gives you some idea of how long this stuff takes. Generally, it's divided into 3 types of system: high-pressure system, and that's kind of to deal with just very short losses in cooling. You'll have depressurization systems and low-pressure systems, which means you can just use something like a normal water pump just to pump water into the core. You have one final last line of defense, which is called a core vent. Now, should the pressure inside the reactor core be too high, you can ask, and you have to ask the Prime Minister in Japan's case, can we release the gases inside the core? Some of them are likely to be radioactive, dangerous to people in the environment. If the Prime Minister gives his go-ahead, you vent the core, and this is what it looks like. You can either vent from that donut, which is a little bit better because it's a bit filtered by the water, or you can vent from the reactor itself, and then it will travel up those big stacks that you see in pictures, and it's released into the environment. So you don't really want to do that, but if you do want to do it, it's a good idea, because it means that you're unlikely to build up a lot of hydrogen in the reactor building, which can lead to an explosion. So earthquake, 2:45 in the afternoon, 2011. You could well remember it. I'm going to show you a little video of the time of the earthquake, and this is filmed in Tokyo. So this is 140 miles from Fukushima, so it's probably 220, 230 miles from where the earthquake actually struck. That was just a few seconds. In Japan, this went on for about half an hour in some parts. The plant itself shook for well over a minute. This was Japan's biggest ever earthquake recorded, 4th biggest earthquake ever recorded by humans. And it did a few things. It damaged infrastructure, so part of the national grid in Japan went down. The transformers were broken, the power lines collapsed. Roads sheared in half, train lines were buckled, so it's very difficult to get any kind of emergency supplies to the plant. Most of your routes in and out are completely damaged. And the thing that really was a problem for Fukushima was that the national grid went down, so they were without what we call off-site power. They were not able to get electricity to. This is what happened 45 minutes later. The video's sped up a little bit. So this is in Fukushima, just south of the nuclear power station. And then you can see there's still some aftershocks going on after the tsunami hits. The earthquake, sorry. And this whole process, the tsunami, doesn't last for very long. You know, it's in and out within a couple of minutes, but pretty significant damage was done as a result. And you can see it's going to start to subside now as if nothing had happened. So at Fukushima, the tsunami came and it overwhelmed the seawall. The seawall was designed at 10 meters. The wave came in at 14 meters. Basically destroyed everything in its path. It was incredibly powerful, never designed to take such a large tsunami. And like I said, they lost all off-site power. So at that point, they had to look after themselves. They had no electricity coming from the grid. This is where the flooding hit from above. So all 6 of the plants were inundated. At the time of the accident, plant number 1, 2, and 3 were operating at full power. Number 4 was being defueled, and 5 and 6 were under inspection. So they were less of a concern initially than reactors 1, 2, and 3. And that red circle there is the wave, which was 17 meters above ground level, so significant. This is how quickly it happens. This is some CCTV pictures, which shows you between the areas between reactors 1 and 2. So at 42 minutes, that's what it looked like. 43 minutes, that's what it looked like. And 1 minute later, all the water's gone. So incredibly quick process. And then a few minutes after that, as if nothing had happened. Except something did happen. And when the off-site power was lost, the emergency procedure was to switch to generators. So you have petrol-powered, diesel-powered generators, which could provide power for 3 or 4 days. Unfortunately, they were flooded. They were built below ground level, and the water completely inundated them. So at that point, you could say that the fate of Fukushima was sealed. Really, no power, loss of emergency power, and there really isn't that much you can do when that happens. This is for the people who tried to fix the problem. All sorts of stuff in your office. That's a problem. Loss of power. So what do? Well, you get loads of batteries and you try and restore power to the emergency systems, which tell you things like internal pressure of the reactor, the water level, the temperature. Simple but very important things. So firefighters got the emergency batteries. They only lasted for a few minutes. So then they ran around the car park trying to take out batteries from people's cars just to try and get some of these emergency systems back up and running. They tried to do hand calculations and keep track of what the pressure levels were like. They also had to do emergency electrical work. The electrical connectors between plants 1, 2, and 3 were all different. So when they tried to share batteries, they couldn't. So they had to do stripping of wire and soldering and all this stuff. That is not the time you want to be doing that kind of thing. So things have definitely changed since then. And I don't quite have time to get into it, but they realized that the fact that it wasn't universal between all 3 was a contributing factor to the accidents. This is what it normally looks like, a control room. It sits about 20 people, very clean, very tidy. This is what it looked like after the accident. They lost all power, they lost all electricity systems, so it was completely dark. They resorted to head torches, and also there was a very big danger of radiation release, so they had to do all of this wearing very uncomfortable hot respirators. Added on top of that is they had no phone lines, apart from one phone line into the reactor, into the control room, so they had no idea what happened to their family or their friends. 18,000 people died during that tsunami, and a lot of these plant workers lost friends and family, and they're trying to operate in this incredibly complicated, noisy, possibly dangerous environment. So I think we should give them quite a lot of credit for that. This is them trying to find emergency procedure documents, and yeah, not a good day at the office. They were there for a long time, very tired. They were given the order to leave, but 50 of them said that they would remain. And in Japan, to go against what your boss says is a big deal. So the 50 of them stayed at the plant to try and maintain some level of control. What they did then was, after the earthquake struck, they decided to go and check on one of the control systems, one of the safety systems. And this is very noisy. There's a lot of steam lines that are broken. They can't hear whether this emergency systems are working or not. And to their criticism, they also didn't know whether the safety systems were working or not, because they've never seen them working. They've never actually tested some of their emergency safety systems. Okay, so what happens? You get the earthquake, automatically you do the scram, so the reaction stops. Then you lose off-site power. It's no big deal, we've got emergency generators. Well, it is a big deal because they're flooded a few minutes after that, so now you have no power. But you have safety systems, passive systems, which will cool the core. They're only designed to cool the core for a few hours. So then, soon after, they failed. And Unit 1 was the oldest reactor. It had the most basic safety system, so that one failed first. Then the core is uncovered, and that basically means that all the water boils off, and now you have a reactor core with no cooling at all. Soon after that, the cooling systems in Units 2 and 3 failed. Then you have a last-ditch attempt. You spray the core, 20,000 litres a minute of water into each core just to try and cool it for a little while. But these are only designed to last maybe an hour or two at tops. At that point, all the cores are uncovered and you have no cooling whatsoever. Then you have uncontrolled heating. The core is still very hot. You have decay heat from the fission process, and they start to get hotter and hotter until they reach 2,800 degrees. That's the melting point of uranium oxide. And this is an animation of what that melting looks like. Not too dissimilar to a candle dripping as it burns. So the fuel is going to settle at the bottom of the reactor core. It's going to eat through the reactor shell, and it's going to spew out. It's either going to spew out or it's going to spray out. Now, if the pressure inside is quite low, it's going to spew out like a big blob, possibly. If it's high pressure, it's going to spray out under very high pressure, and it's going to go absolutely everywhere. And nobody quite knows which one of those two happened. The other thing that you have is this zirconium, this fuel that you wrap in this cladding. At high temperature, it starts to react exothermically with the water, and you produce hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is explosive, and here's a little copy of live news from the BBC. It's not an amazing video, and there isn't actually very good video at all of the explosions happening, and this is as good as I could find. So,
an explosion was heard and smoke seen at the power plant this morning, and here it is.
Wow. So this happened 3 times, spewing a lot of radioactive material over the immediate site. So at this point, if you've been paying attention, you'll be wondering why didn't they vent those hydrogen gases from the reactor core and the reactor building? And I'm going to read to you a little something. So this is Prime Minister Khan, Prime Minister of Japan at the time, talking to TEPCO. And TEPCO is the Tokyo Electric Power Company, and they were in charge of the site. And Prime Minister Khan says, TEPCO said it wanted to do venting. So I told TEPCO to do it, but it didn't. I asked why, but there wasn't a reply. I thought things would go wrong if they kept going on like this. Site Chief Yoshida, the guy in charge of the site, this chap here on the right, he said, we will do the venting, we will do it even if we have to form a suicide corps. There was discussion that they would choose some individuals, hopefully they would volunteer, to go into the most radioactive part of the building, possibly receiving a lethal dose of radiation, to manually release the vent. Pretty sobering idea to be to even consider doing that. But it didn't happen. They didn't vent. And the reason is that the venting system works generally quite easily when you have power. Without power, you have to do it manually. Manually is difficult because you need compressed air generators, and also you need instructions on how to do it. They didn't know how to do it because they'd never seen the manual plans. They had to go to the administration building. They had to look through 10,000 pages of documents to find the electrical diagram to tell them how to vent. So they never even considered the idea, if we lose all power, how do we do these emergency procedures? This happened. These are some pictures of the morning after. So that those explosions, incredibly energetic hydrogen gas is the most energetic, has the highest calorific content of all gases and liquids, petrol, diesel, what have you. Very, very explosive. Then it blew the top of the building off, and 3 of them. This is reactor number 4. I've been to buildings like this, a few of them. They are incredibly well built. You know, the walls are a good 3-4 meters thick. You know, when I first saw these pictures and then I went to the site, I was really blown away just about how powerful these explosions are. And if you've been paying attention, you'll notice this is reactor number 4. Reactor number 4 was defueled at the time, so why did it explode? The reason it exploded was that reactor number 3 and reactor number 4, they used to use the same vent line. So if either of them had to vent the reactor core, they'd use the same pipe. And what happened was that the gas from unit 3 came across into unit 4, rose to the top of the building, and then exploded. So this is a section of the wall. Again, really, really powerful stuff. The other thing that the other thing that possibly did occur in Fukushima, and nobody knows for sure, is a thing called a steam explosion. The steam explosion happens if you have a hot liquid, usually if you have a hot metal in a liquid form and you put it into water. What happens is that water boils very quickly and it becomes quite an explosive mix. You vaporize that water almost instantly. This is a little video from Sandia National Laboratories in the US, and what they were doing, they were simulating this. They wondered, well, what would happen if we had a reactor meltdown and then we'd been trying to cool it and there was water in the basement, so then this hot fuel fell into a big pool of water. So they didn't use uranium in this experiment. For obvious reasons, they used some lead, but it's a pretty similar physical process. So here's the molten lead being released from the top. And here you'll see it fall into this bucket of water. This may well have happened in Fukushima. We don't really know. It's possible, but to be determined. And just for historically, this was one of the biggest concerns that they had in Chernobyl as well. They were worried that a huge amount of the nuclear fuel that happened in Chernobyl might also fall into a large pool of water. And the problem with this is that it's such a violent explosion that it would scatter a lot of material in a very large area because the containment structure possibly might not be able to deal with an explosion that big. So the day after, these are initial dose measurements. So the people who were working on the site, they quickly went to evaluate where the most radioactive areas of the site were so that you wouldn't go somewhere. They'd carry red spray paint with them. And if they happened to find something particularly radioactive, they'd circle it in red paint to tell you to remove it as soon as possible. So this is an access door here to some electrical plant room inside the building. Can't get into it. So this impeded a lot of their rescue efforts that they had. They couldn't get stuff delivered by boat either because the access ramps were completely damaged. So even if you tried to get some fire trucks from further down the coast or further up the coast, you couldn't land them on the beach. And they, in their desperation to cool the core, they used seawater. The problem with that is that nobody's ever done it before. Nobody really knows what happens when you mix seawater in a very hot reactor. And also the fire trucks weren't powerful enough to suck up such a huge amount of water. But maybe the explosions actually weren't all bad. This is the spent fuel pool of unit number 4. And in here you've got about 5 or 6 years worth of spent fuel just sitting in the pool, being kept cool. And if you don't actively cool that water, the water's going to start to boil and it's going to evaporate. and if it evaporates, you're going to expose all the fuel in the spent fuel pool. It's going to melt, it's going to catch on fire, and then you've got a huge disaster because it's directly into the atmosphere. There's no containing that spent fuel. But there's a great big hole in the side of the building, so you can pump water from a fire truck or from one of these concrete pouring machines. So they're desperately pumping water into the spent fuel pool to make sure it was topped up. Had the building not have blown up, it's quite possible that that wouldn't have been possible, and there may well have been a fire in the spent fuel pools as well. Immediately after, there was some radiation mapping done by the American military. They flew Black Hawk helicopters up and down the prefecture, taking dose measurements, trying to evaluate where is this radiation going and should we be concerned about a particular area more than others. On the day of the accident, 90% of the fuel which was ejected fell into the ocean, and then the wind changed, and about 10% was taken inland. And Professor Tom Scott at the university here, he's done a lot of work on this mapping. So what they decided to evacuate. Their evacuation procedures were very poor. The people at TEPCO didn't even know what the emergency procedures were. They had to go and check all of their internal documents to find them. And they were criticized heavily by the IAEA about how bad their evacuation procedures were. But anyway, the other thing they did in the sort of weeks and months afterwards, they decided to scoop up 10 centimeters of soil in a large area of Fukushima and put it into these enormous bags. Each bag is about this big. I think it's probably about a ton. And there are absolutely thousands of them. And they don't really know what to do with them. And every time I go back, there's more, and they seem to just move them from one place to the other. I think they're just going to leave them there. But again, that's another one to be determined. It's actually, part of it is actually to be seen to be doing more than it actually does. It's actually not a particularly effective way of cleaning up a contaminated area. So let's put some of these radiation levels in context. The background level of radiation in Bristol is about 0.18. This is pretty normal for most cities in the world. This is Hiroshima. So this is, what is it now, 70-odd years after the dropping of the first atomic bomb. A little bit higher, not much higher. This is perfectly fine. Mary Curie's laboratory. I'm sorry to say I don't know how long ago she died, but it's a while, 70, 80 years or something. So after all of the work she's done, it's a little bit more radioactive. You may be concerned, but you shouldn't be really. The other thing is when I fly to, well, when any of you fly at high altitude, you're exposed to radiation from the sun, and the atmosphere blocks it out at ground level, but when you're higher up, it doesn't. And at peak levels, you get around 3 microsieverts an hour. So that's normal places. This is in Japan. This is me and Bruce. This is about 10 kilometers from the site, so about the same as Bristol. We weren't particularly concerned. We were then on a bus on our way to Fukushima, and we happened to drive through one of the areas which had a higher percentage of fallout, and the level is a little bit higher, and this is where people can't live. So these areas are sort of restricted, but you can drive through them. You can't walk and cycle through them, but you can drive through them. This is about 100 meters from the reactor cores themselves, so really, really close. But it just so happened that when the radiation was released, it went up and then fell. So underneath that arc, there's less radioactive fallout than you might think. Finally, this is the highest dose I was exposed to whilst I've been there, and I've been there a few times. So it's 250. Sounds like a lot, but actually, when we compare it to the amount of radiation you receive, it's not that high. So when I fly to Japan, it's a 12-hour flight there and back, and during that time, I maybe receive up to 70 microsieverts. I'm only at Fukushima between this is reactor building number 1. I'm only there for about a minute, so I actually receive a very small amount of radiation whilst I'm visiting. So flying to Japan is much worse for me. It isn't worse because none of these levels are particularly dangerous, but I receive more radiation going there than when I actually get there. There's a beach in Brazil which has a background radiation level of 150. So to put it into some context, so there you are, reactor number 2, reactor number 3, you're standing between the two of them, you're about 40 and 40 meters from the two most radioactive areas in the world, kind of. And you're getting about twice what you would on a beach in Brazil. So not particularly dangerous. My mum disagrees. She thinks it's the worst place and I should never go. Okay, so this is Fukushima-Daichi from above, and there is some work to be done, and that work could well last over 100 years. The first job was to cool the reactors, stop that reaction, keep them cool, stop them remelting and then moving around inside the basements again. And that's been done. That is currently being done. They're still pumping water into it. The second thing they had to do was make the site safe. You're going to have an awful lot of people working there, construction workers, engineers, electricians, you name it. Everybody works there. There's an awful lot of staff that work there full time. So you have to make the whole site as safe as possible. The area you can't make perfectly safe is the reactors themselves. The other thing you have to do is you have to remove the spent fuel from the spent fuel pools. They've achieved that in reactor number 4, but they have yet to do it for 1, 2, and 3. The other thing they have to do is they have to find where the molten fuel is. You can only remove it if you know where it is. And that's kind of been done, but not entirely. Each one of those reactors has about 90 tons of uranium. And when it's molten, it flows very quickly. And if there's any nooks and crannies in the basement, it will go there. They then have to remove the fuel. Nobody's ever done it before. It hasn't been done in Chernobyl, which was 30 years ago. They're not even close to doing it in Fukushima. And the last thing you have to do is you have to decontaminate a very, very large area, not just the site itself, but the surrounding area. You've had to evacuate something like 300,000 people from the area, and a lot of them haven't come back. The population has dropped. Fukushima, as a county, it's in trouble, and not just because of the radioactive fallout. A lot of young people have left. They've gotten jobs in other cities. They're not coming back. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Japan copes with that. You may well also have heard of the contaminated water. It's been in the press a lot, and it's a concern for people. The radioactivity is leaking some of it into the ocean, although very, very small quantities are actually leaking into the ocean. And what happens is you have natural groundwater, it's raining, and Japan's very mountainous. You have a lot of mountains, and then the mountains level out, and then you have a little strip of where you can live and where you can build stuff. So a lot of groundwater is running down, and it comes into the reactor building, because these are built below ground level. But the Japanese fishing industry and the people are not too happy with the idea of it being released, even though most experts in nuclear remediation and safety would tell you it's actually probably safer to release that contaminated water on a day-by-day basis and not to release it all at once. Because you're going to have to keep building these tanks. And these areas in red are all these tanks. And some of these tanks are 500,000-litre tanks, absolutely full of this stuff. So when I last went to Japan, I went with a UK delegation, and they said the best thing to do would be to release it day by day. But it's a hard sell to people who were initially lied to by TEPCO. TEPCO wasn't always particularly honest, so the people are hesitant. Their approval of nuclear was around 70% before the accident. Now it's dropped to about 15%. So people aren't particularly happy there. In terms of the radioactivity in the water, first of all, I'll bring your attention that this is a log scale. And along the bottom, we've got time since the accident. And here we're looking at cesium, cesium-134 and cesium-137. These are particularly concerned for human interaction. And these dashed lines tell you what is the Japanese government safety level. So you could quite easily eat fish anywhere in Japan which is below that level. So very quickly, after about 6 months, the radioactivity in the water, and this is only about 20 meters from the plant, the radioactivity is actually very low. So I'm often asked whether we should be concerned with radioactivity leaking into the ocean, and not in the slightest. The ocean is incredibly big, and you dissolve a lot of that. You don't dissolve it, sorry. What's the word I'm looking for? You dilute it. Yeah, you dilute it so much that it really isn't much of a concern. And all of the fish in Fukushima is safe to eat. The only one that they're still limiting the sale on is bottom-feeding fish, because some of those fish happen to consume some of the particles that fell into the ocean. But otherwise, quite a safe place to go for a swim. The other thing that they've had to do, and they've had to do a lot of, is they've had to clean up the site. You're going to have to do a lot of work there. There's going to be a lot of machinery moving around, so you have to make it as safe as possible. So these are some before and after pictures where they've removed most of the rubble, including a bus from the basement of one of the buildings. So when you go there now, it actually doesn't look like a disaster site. It looks like a big construction site, really. So that's, yeah. So here is reactor number 2 here. And here you can get very, very close to it. This is a UK delegation who went to visit recently. And what they've done is they've covered the whole site in concrete. They've sprayed it about a foot thick to keep most of that dust and radioactive dust down. They've completely fixed the seawall. And they've designed all of this in mind should another earthquake or a tsunami hit. So the whole process has to still be able to occur should this unthinkably large earthquake happen again. The last picture is a picture of the uniforms that you have to wear. So if you are in the green zone, which is a good 90% of the site, you can get away with just a mask and just normal clothing. This is normal clothing that you'd wear at a nuclear site. Only if you go very close to the reactor sites, which are here, do you have to wear overalls. And if you visit, like I did a few times, you just go on as you are. You don't have to wear anything. No gloves, no shoe covers, nothing. But they're getting there, and they are working very, very hard to get there. And I've just got a little video to show you what they've done. They've removed all of the fuel from the spent fuel pool of unit number 4.
A milestone is being reached in the recovery of Fukushima-Daichi. For the first time since the accident, spent fuel will be removed from the damaged building and stored in a safer, more secure way in these specially designed containers. Moving the spent fuel out of the damaged reactor building and into safe, permanent storage lays the groundwork for moving forward with remediation of the damaged building.
So that's good news. That's great work. But it was the easiest one to do. It was challenging, but there wasn't any radioactivity within reactor number 4. So not an easy job, but not the most difficult one. So they have picked the easiest ones first. And the good thing about fixing a nuclear disaster is that the longer you wait, the better, because a lot of the radioactive material dies away. But you don't want to wait too long because a lot of this infrastructure is starting to age. These buildings are 50, 60 years old. So if you wait too long, they could crumble or they could collapse, and they've been damaged by the earthquake. So you have to balance those two things. But they're getting there for unit number 3. So this is 2011, just after the accident, no roof. 2016, they've cleaned the roof up completely, and they're starting to build a base on which they will build a new fuel handling machine and big crane to remove that fuel from the spent fuel pool. And they're going to have to hermetically seal the whole building. And the danger is that when they're removing some of this fuel, some of it's going to be damaged. And if that gets into the atmosphere, the operators are going to be exposed to it. So the whole building is going to be sealed from the environment should there be some kind of an accident. This is last month, so you can go and have a walk around the top of it, and 30 meters below you is the remainder of the molten fuel from the core. During the earthquake was so powerful, that big refueling crane I showed you, it fell into the spent fuel pool. That's bad news because it will have damaged a lot of the spent fuel. It would have bent it and warped it. So when you try and remove it, you could scratch it open. You could bend it. So nobody really knows what the state of the spent fuel pool is. So whilst it's relatively easy to do compared to fixing the cores themselves, not an easy job by any means. And this is an absolutely enormous crane lifting a huge crane out of the building. So this spent fuel pool is now ready for cleanup. The problem is they have a lot of rubble, a lot of concrete which has fallen into the pool. So for context, that little handle that you see is probably about that big. So really sizable bits of rubble. And the danger is a lot of that rubble would have fallen in between the gaps. And then when you were drawing it, those rocks and that rubble can split all of that fuel open, and then you've got radiation release. Yeah, and so for context, that's about the size of these fuel bundles that you have. So pretty big. And about 300 kilograms each. Okay, so now some pretty exciting video for me and for you. I think you'll love it. We are going to go inside reactor unit number 3, and we're going to go through this beautifully designed valve. So here we are. We're now going into an area called the PCV, which houses the reactor and the control rods. This is what 6 years of water and salt water is going to do. You're going to corrode. Normally, when you go to a nuclear power station and you walk inside this area very close to the reactor, it's like an operating theatre. It's incredibly clean. It's very, very tidy. But in here, not so much. And those white sparkles you can see, that's radiation on the camera itself. And here's a robot designed by Hitachi called Little Sunfish, and is going for a swim inside the water, which is being still pumped in there to keep the fuel cool. So here you can see some of this orange material, and the estimate is that that is nuclear material, which was sprayed out of the core. Nobody's absolutely certain, but that's the most likely candidate. So this robot swam around for a couple of hours. It's very disorientating, and they had to call in a lot of the chaps who used to work there, and they'd sit them all around a room, and they were like, do you recognize that staircase? Do you know where that thing used to be? To try and build up an idea of exactly where is this robot. Because it's really difficult to know where that robot is, because the whole building is designed to keep radiation in, so you can't transmit your position. So it's really hard to know where is the robot. And the only way you can really do it is by collating these images together. So there's some important results that came out of it. These are some of the areas that house the control rods. They're rusted, but they're generally in pretty good shape. There's a lot of accumulation of rock and rubble, which is possibly a material called corium. Now, corium is a very loosely defined term, and it's core material and concrete. When core material, uranium meets concrete, it chemically interacts, and you produce this very messy, heterogeneous material. So that could be what we're looking at there. This is one at the bottom of the control rods, and the fact that you've got orange material around the bolts could mean that the fuel has actually burned its way through the control rods and is dripping down into the basement. And the other thing is you've got a lot of corrosion. 6 years of water is going to cause a lot of rust and a lot of corrosion. This is a concern because if you try and bring in some kind of a robot to do some of the cleaning up, if that robot sits on something very rusty, it could fall. So you don't really know whether a lot of your structures can take much weight or not. A picture of some sludge, very radioactive sludge. This is most likely a mixture of uranium and steel and all the other material that's melted inside the reactor. And it's burned away a lot of the floor, and normally a corrugated steel floor. So these are pretty recent results. And normally, like you saw this picture before, this area is very, very nice and very clean, a nice floor to stand on. And this is what it looks like today. These are the tops of the control rods. This should be a floor, but the floor looks like it's melted away. So that gives us some indication that the temperature inside there got very, very hot. So it's more than likely that the fuel has fallen down into the basement. Okay, I'm going to show you a video now. It's a little disorientating because what happened is they took many, many, many pictures. It's the world's most expensive selfie stick. It's essentially a robotic arm with a camera on the end, and that camera photographs in all sorts of different directions. And they've combined it into one image. So we're going to now have a look at an inspection which happened last week. Some very recent results. So here we are. We're looking upwards. So we're now looking into the control rods. You can see most of them are in good shape. These wires have burned away from the temperature. There's a big hole over here, which could be where a large amount of material fell through the reactor core. So nobody really knows exactly what happened. A lot of people have tried to model this melting process, how the fuel interacts inside the reactor core, but nobody really knows. So here's that picture of that sludge again, and there should be floor here, and there should be floor here and here. So a lot of the floor has fallen away. So initially people thought, well, we'll just drive a robot in, and then the robot can take some pictures, but you can't drive the robot on that stuff. But maybe you will one day. You know, the Japanese government has said we'll fix it within 40 years. If you talk to anybody offline, you know, afterwards they're like, it's going to be a lot more than 40 years. So possibly 100 years worth of work, a job for life in Fukushima. Okay, the next bit, I was particularly impressed with these results. These are actually quite amazing. This is in the basement. So this is the very lowest level of the buildings. This is in reactor number 2. So you have the reactor here, you have the control rods, you have the floor, which you just saw. And now this is the basement. And the idea is that there's 90 tons worth of fuel somewhere here. So again, a slightly disorientating video, but not too bad. So this is looking directly down onto the floor, and you can see a lot of pebbles and rubble. Normally that wouldn't be in there, so that gives us an idea that possibly a lot of this fuel was sprayed out under very high pressure, and in so doing reacted possibly with the concrete. This machine here, this is a machine which replaces control rods. That looks in relatively good condition. There's a bit of floor which has fallen away. The rest of it looks generally quite good shape. I'm not entirely sure what this area is, but it's possibly a thing called a drain sump, which is basically a hole in the ground to soak up some water if you've got a leak inside. So yeah, very impressive results when I saw them, and very recent as well. So this is in reactor number 2. Numbers 1 is going to be the worst because it had no cooling for well over a day, so that's probably going to be the one which is in the worst physical condition. And Unit 3 is underwater, and you saw that video of that earlier. So nobody quite knows what that looks like because the water's very dirty, so you can't have a look inside. But we do have some idea of what we might find when we actually go inside the reactors themselves. There was comparatively a minor accident in 3 Mile Island, and there it's a different type of reactor, but essentially the same thing, and the reactor lost cooling, and it started to melt. So when they finally opened it up in 1984, they saw that some of these fuel assemblies had become warped and bent under the high temperature. That was the first thing that we will find in Fukushima, probably. The second thing is some of the fuel rods would have scattered around inside. Thirdly, this rubble bed of this mixture of steel and uranium and any other material inside the reactor, it's all molten into this big mess. I haven't told you a single thing about what it is that I actually do for my job. This is the reason why we're involved. You can use acoustic imaging to try and build up an idea of what the core looks like inside or in the water, and that's kind of how I got into this whole work. And lastly, there's big lumps, pebbles of mixture of material, and we expect to see a lot of that. And we found about 50 tons of it in 3 Mile Island, and that was a bit smaller than the one in Fukushima, so we expect similar stuff to have happened. What are they going to do? Well, at some point they're going to have to remove all this material. Easier said than done. Nobody's ever done it before. So they spent a long time trying to come up with some process to do that. The Japanese government put them under considerable pressure, possibly more pressure than they should have been under, because you don't want to make decisions like this too quickly. And they came up with 3 possible solutions. One is, let's flood the whole building, and then we're going to have a crane that's just going to pick out piece by piece, and we'll laser cut, and we'll chop, and we'll just remove it all piece by piece, possibly over 40, 50 years. The problem with that is that the earthquake fractured the concrete, so there's an awful lot of leaks inside the building itself. So you'd have to keep pumping water in, and then the water is going to leak out So then you've got more contaminated water to deal with. So this was not chosen. The second one was, well, why don't we try and do it dry from the top? The problem with that is that you have to build a very heavy crane which is going to sit on top of the building. The problem with that is that the building could well be very damaged, so you can't use that approach either, so that was rejected. The final one they're going to use is they're going to cut a hole in the side of the building, and then they're going to use essentially a digger and some kind of mechanical system to remove a lot of this fuel. This, at the moment, is just a diagram. This is as far as they've come, really, with proposing how they're going to remove a lot of this fuel. So the timeline is very long, and a lot of these technologies have yet to be developed. But the one thing that they have done is that they've developed a lot of interesting robots to do that. This one, which I'm particularly well acquainted with, is a shape-changing robot. Some of these reactors have very small access, so this robot changes shape. You put it in a narrow tube, and then once it's inside, it changes shape and it can move around. They've got normal diggers and a swimming robot. It looks like a snake. That's pretty cool. I'm not entirely sure where they're going to deploy that. The other thing they've got is they've got very expensive clean hoovers, which pick up a lot of the dust and material inside the building, so when they eventually go inside, they can clean a lot of that up. So at this point, I think it's important to put this accident in context. The other nuclear accident, which we're all possibly familiar with, either professionally or we're aware of the name anyway, is the Chernobyl accident, which happened in 1986. Chernobyl, this is the map to scale, same size. Chernobyl was landlocked, essentially, and it spewed a lot of radioactive material over a very large area. Possibly around 10 times more radiation was released from Chernobyl than it was from Fukushima. So Fukushima comparatively is a lot smaller. And it's difficult to estimate how many people would have lost their lives from Chernobyl. The best estimates are around 4,000 people will have a life cut short by the Chernobyl accident. With Fukushima, it's a different story. It's quite possibly going to be a lot less than that. And the reason is because the evacuation was better carried out. And also, one of the big causes of deaths in Chernobyl was that people would absorb some of the radioactive material in their thyroid gland. And a lot of that is because they were malnourished, so their body would suck that up as soon as possible. That's why you're given iodine pills to stop that happening. In Fukushima, people are very well nourished, so their body has no particular reason to absorb a lot of this material. And Professor Philip Thomas at the university has done a lot of work on what's going to happen as a result of what happened in Fukushima from a health point of view. And the best estimate is that quite likely nobody's actually going to die from Fukushima. It's a contentious issue for a lot of people. Certainly nobody died from acute radiation poisoning or anything like that. The maximum radiation received by any of the workers was no higher than 100 millisieverts for the technical people in the room. So from that point of view, obviously a serious accident, and there has been around 2,000 people who died as a result of the evacuation. So a lot of older people in Japan, they were moved, and that's a lot of stress. It introduces bad habits, not sleeping properly, eating too much, drinking too much. Suicide is also a problem. So it's a serious issue, but we should keep it in mind. The other thing we should keep in mind is how dangerous other types of energy generation are. This is the deaths per kilowatt hour. So coal, one of the biggest killers for people who work in the coal industry, people who transport it, mine it. The radiation, the material which is released during the combustion of coal, that's bad, it's pollution, it's bad for your lungs, that will kill you as well. Oil's pretty bad. Hydroelectric dams, they have had habits of bursting. That kills a lot of people. Solar, the reason solar's in there is because there's a big increase in the amount of solar energy being installed, and that means a lot more cars on the road, a lot more trucks, a lot more people installing solar panels on roofs, a lot of people falling from roofs. There's no such thing as a free lunch. If you're going to want to get some energy, you're going to have to pay some kind of a price. And it just so happens that from a death point of view, actually nuclear has one of the highest and the best safety records of all of them. So again, it's worth keeping in mind. So what's the impact of the accident in Japan and more globally? Well, in Japan, there was a dramatic drop in nuclear power support. People weren't particularly happy. Japan also turned all their nuclear power plants off. They've turned a few of them back on. And because they turned them all off, they had to buy a lot of natural gas from Russia. So now they're burning a lot of natural gas, producing more carbon dioxide. So that's not great. A lot of people were evacuated. Like I said, I think it's either 150,000 or 300,000 people were evacuated. I think 150,000 were ordered to evacuate, but a lot more people chose to evacuate because they were quite scared, understandably. The other societal impact is large mental health issues for the people who were evacuated. The environmental aspect, this is in Fukushima. It's amazing. I've been now 3 or 4 times, and every time I go, Japan's in the tropics. It's quite incredible to see just how quickly nature is starting to reclaim a lot of these land and areas where people don't live. So the environmental point, like I said, it's about 10% of what happened with Chernobyl, and that's a very well documented and very well understood event, so we can learn something from what happened in Chernobyl. Health effects. I'm not an expert in health physics by any means, so this is what I've been able to glean from experts in the field. Around 2,300 people who did die, but not directly as a result of the accident. Nobody had acute radiation sickness, so that's certainly a positive. And the best projection, it's very difficult to diagnose the future health of a nation when you have low levels of radiation, is that it's going to have a minimal impact, is what I've been able to read. Finally, well, what's the industrial impact globally and in Japan? Japan was 30% nuclear powered, it's now 4%. So like I said, you have to compensate for that somehow. The whole process is estimated to cost about $500,000 million. That's about 10% of Japan's GDP, so it's expensive. That's going to cost you a lot of money to fix. But on the plus side, stress tests were carried out at similar plants directly afterwards. So all nuclear power plants around the world, they learned a lesson from Japan, and the lesson was you have an incredibly rare earthquake and then you have an incredibly rare tsunami. What happens when we have them both happen at the same time? Because if either of those had happened, they would have been fine. But the fact that 2 happened at the same time means they weren't. And also there was negligence on the behalf of the Japanese, undoubtedly. Okay, so with that, this is a picture of me in Japan at the first. The whole reason I am here is because the UK has had a long history of nuclear power with Japan. We sold them the first ever nuclear reactor, and they trust us to do good work, so I'm here doing good work. And if you would like to have a little bit more of a technical idea of what's going on, recently Bruce and I were asked to write an article for Physics World, What Next for Fukushima? And if you'd like to read a little something on your way home, please come and grab a copy. And with that, I thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we can have some questions. So same design, there's not many of them because they're pretty old, they're starting to get phased out. I think there's like 35 in the US, but they're soon to come to end of life. And the thing that they identified was that they were unable to provide sufficient cooling, and the pipework was too complicated, and they didn't have too many valves and all this stuff to provide cooling. So what they've done is they've installed new pipework, which basically goes from the outside of the building directly into the core. So it's one pipe, you plug in your fire truck, and off you go. And all the power plants in Japan, what they've done is every power station now has a large area which houses emergency equipment, which is just up a ramp, a concrete ramp. You just drive down to the reactor building. There you've got fire trucks with high power pumps. They also have robotic systems which they load onto helicopters. And there's 2 emergency response centers in Japan. If there's another similar event, the robots get loaded onto the helicopter, get flown to the site. The other improvements that they've done is they've got drones, very fashionable thing to have, but they're very useful because you can do radiation mapping. You can get live data from above. Because you saw that video on BBC when the plant exploded. The only way that the site operators knew that it exploded is because they were watching the news. These buildings are so isolated that they didn't know what happened. There was lack of communication, so they're watching the news and they're like, oh, that's bad. The other thing that they've done is now they've simplified the emergency venting system so that it should be much simpler. You shouldn't have to look through thousands of diagrams. And all the site operators are now trained in basic valve operation, which they weren't necessarily involved in before. So you can't say it's never going to happen again, but if the risk was 1 in a million, now it's 1 in 100 million. So the risk is definitely mitigated. Could it happen in the UK? Could it happen to Hinkley C when Hinkley C is eventually complete? Probably not. As far as I know, Hinkley C has a design of passive safety systems which will allow you to walk away for 3 days, and it can cool itself. And at that point, you would have enough time to bring in additional safety systems, I guess. Anybody else? You can ask me anything you want.
Do you think it was the Japanese culture that led them to have such a poor response to the accident?
I'd be really overstepping my mark if I answered that question. I can, however, in my time in Japan, I certainly can see how certain aspects of Japanese culture may have contributed to the confusion during the accident. And one of those is so let's say that I'm at work and I find that one of the microscopes is broken. I go to my boss and I say the microscope is broken, but you take personal responsibility for that news. So it's almost as if you're responsible for what's happened. So there's an inclination for people not necessarily to tell you the absolute truth, because if the truth is really bad, you take personal responsibility for it. So if you look at the chain of events of some of the news being passed from the sort of the operator all the way up to the head of the corporation, the news sort of gets diluted. So that's a contributing factor, and they certainly were criticized quite heavily on the confusion that was going on during the communication between each other. And I wouldn't like to say, because I don't think you can really answer that question, but I could see how it could happen. Yeah. But there was certainly some complacency in the system, which could be a Japanese trait. I don't know. They had absolute faith that their safety system would work, so that they weren't necessarily too concerned with other aspects, which they should have been. And also a lack of training. In France, they have a much different system where they will stress test. It's like, the electrical system's gone down, and there's a flood, and there's a break-in. How do you cope with that? They do a lot of this multi-layer testing, and I don't think they did that in Japan. But I think they've taken that criticism on board very well, and I'm confident that should something like that happen again, the response would be much better. Long answer, short question. But I saw a hand.
Can you repeat the question to the video? And we've got one from YouTube. Can a venting system be developed that can be used without power in an emergency?
Pass. I imagine. Okay, so the question was, did they hear that question? Okay, so the first question was, could a similar accident happen again at a similar plant? And the second question was, could Japanese culture have contributed to the accident? And the third question, could a venting system be developed which is completely passive? I'm not sure. I imagine there's some very technical people in the room. I'm generally looking over here. that may know a bit more about the ins and outs of a venting system than I do. Now, the Japanese system that they had at Fukushima was if you had electrical power, you could vent the reactor quite easily. They were electrically operated valves, but the problem is that because they didn't have power, they didn't know whether the valves were open or not. There was confusing signals. And you could do it manually, which is when this idea of this suicide group came up, would be to send somebody in to manually operate those valves. But it was such a confusing system that they didn't really know. So it's quite interesting when you look at the evolution of the safety systems from power plants from the early days to now. You'd think they'd get more complicated, but actually they get simpler, so that you have a much simpler system to understand should you have what you call a loss of coolant accident. Anybody else?
How far into the future will the decay heat be low enough that you can just pour concrete on it and forget about it?
We have an engineer in the room. You could argue that is a short-term solution. The problem with the question was, how long will it take before the fuel is cool enough just to cover it in concrete? The problem with that is that as the material decays, it can swell. If it comes in contact with water, it can react and it can swell. So you don't really want to encase it in concrete. You do want to remove it. So if you've ever cooked yourself something that's too hot, like a soup, if you want a soup to cool down, you spread it out into a bigger plate. You have a larger surface area, and it's going to cool a lot quicker. To cool spent fuel, it's a lot of these fuel rods, and the water can get in and out, and you pump cold water around it, and it cools really efficiently. When that all melts into a blob, you have a much smaller surface area, so you have to cool it for a lot longer. And they've been cooled. Now they pump in water around 17 degrees. It comes out around 30 degrees. So we know that the remnants of the core are still very hot. And I think they do tweak the amount of water they're pumping in less and less, but not yet. And also they did broach the idea of a sarcophagus type of idea. Let's just bury the whole thing in concrete and forget about it. But it was just a no-go with the Japanese public. They demanded a complete cleanup of the site. Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, when you talk to people from Sellafield, they kind of think that Fukushima, it's bad, but it's not that bad. Whilst Sellafield doesn't have some of these molten fuel dangers and a lot of this earthquake-damaged infrastructure, they have an awful lot of highly radioactive material. Sellafield is one of the most complicated decommissioning sites on the planet. And that's a 100-year plus timeline. And the radiation levels here are pretty minor compared to some of the stuff at Sellafield.
The water being stored in the tank farms, is it being treated or just?
Yeah, it's treated. So so this is what happens. That you pump in cold water to cool the fuel and whatever's left. You then remove almost all of the isotopes with 2 chemical processing plants. You then pump it back into the core, but what you're left with is this tritiated water that you just can't do anything with. There's no chemical process to remove tritium from water, and they just keep it in the tanks. It's a very big tank and an awfully small amount of radioactivity in there. Anybody else? I saw another hand somewhere.
Emergency response at one point and suggested it was not very good. Did they not have an emergency planning process? I know this is beyond a design basis accident, but at the same time, it sounded like the operators weren't terribly familiar with the plant and a sort of emergency response they should make to the plant.
So sorry, I forgot to repeat the earlier question. The earlier question was about the water that is treated. The second question was about my criticism of the emergency response and did they have an emergency response plan in place. They did, but the emergency plan never took into account a loss of off-site power and a loss of emergency backup power.
That's why I said it was way beyond design basis.
Yeah.
But it sounded like from what you said, the operators weren't terribly familiar with the plant operation.
Yeah,
in extreme conditions.
yeah, they were not. They were not. So that's why they had to move from building number 1 to walk the 100-odd meters to the administration building, basically just an office, and look through 10,000 documents. And then they see them, and then it's quite possible that your friends and family have just died, and then you've been asked to look through paperwork to come up with some, it's a big ask of anybody, but certainly I don't think that the emergency procedures were there. And they certainly did telephone another power company called KEPCO to ask them if they knew what the emergency process were if you lost both. So, yeah. But it's so easy to say this stuff after, right? It's, I think I saw another hand somewhere around here. Anybody?
There were some irregularities at Sellafield quite a long time ago. They were processing some Japanese material as a suddenly cracked up. And the Japanese at the time were critical of the irregularities, the false data and what have you. Which country is actually the safest now?
Good.
Germany switched off anyway.
Yeah, good question. So the question is which. I'm summarising your question. Forgive me, but the question was which country is the safest. This is outside of my domain to answer truthfully, but I was recently at a conference in Poland for a severe nuclear accident conference, and there I got to talk to an inspector from the IAEA. For those that don't know, the IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Association. They oversee the operation of nuclear facilities, storage, transportation, everything. Very big organization. I spoke to him, and he said, France. He said, without a doubt, the French system is the best because they have such rigorous tests for multiple accidents happening simultaneously. Also, they've been very honest with any accidents that they've had. They've reported them quite quickly, whereas other countries haven't. Certainly Russia springs to mind for not opening up about accidents that they've had. The other thing he said that was a really big factor in it was the level of education that the operators receive. And he said that in places like, maybe this will come back to haunt me, but he said that places like India, for example, they have highly educated plant operators. So you go to university, you learn nuclear plant operation, and you get a job at a nuclear power plant. And he said to me, actually, the best people for the jobs are plumbers and electricians, which have been trained up for a more complicated system. He said that there's an over-reliance in certain countries to academic capability as opposed to real-world hands-on experience. And also, how do you cope in a highly stressful environment? That's another thing that you possibly can't really test for in an interview. So he said France, and France is, I think, 85, 90% nuclear powered. We buy some power from them occasionally. They've said that they might turn some of them off. I think the Minister of Environment said that he'd turn them off, which is, to me, from an engineering point of view, it's a bit of an odd decision to make. It's the cleanest source of power that we have in the quantity that we have. So to make an environmental case to turn it off, I think, is a difficult one. Yeah, I mean, if you want to, it's a good read. The IAEA report into the Fukushima accident. There's a 700-page version, or there's an 80-page version, with a 2-page summary. So, if you read the 2 pages, you'll be enthralled, and you'll read the rest of it. But in that, they are very critical of Japan. So that's why, for me, when I first heard about Fukushima, I do remember, I've been to Japan many times, and my brother lives there, and whenever I've been to Japan, you're overwhelmed with how technically capable they are. And then I remember thinking, well, what's going on? How can they drop the ball like this? It must be that nuclear power is actually quite dangerous. But it turns out it was just unbelievably bad luck. Some complacency, and also trying to operate. Can you think of a more stressful environment to work in? I certainly can't. So, one more?
Yeah. So I'm just picking up on your last point that sort of saying nuclear is the most green that you can sort of think of. So, if that's the case, but we know that Sellafield's a 100-year effort, Fukushima's going to be a 100-year effort. Is decommissioning going to overtake that that CO2 offset?
Yeah, and so the question was, if you given that you have to decommission Sellafield, which is a 100-year process, and Fukushima could be a 100-year process, is that whole process of decommissioning and the cost and effort involved, does it offset all of the reduction in carbon that you've produced as a result? It's estimated that nuclear power has contributed to the saving of 1.8 million lives since the beginning of nuclear power. So because we haven't released so much pollution into the environment, we've saved almost 2 million people. So if you've had some number of thousands die from nuclear, I mean, I don't want to be the person that decides that, but it seems like a pretty good trade-off to me, given how dangerous other sources of energy are. Does it offset it? No. So recently, the Japanese Interior Ministry, or the Japanese Association of Sciences, they produced a report that looked at exactly that question. Is Fukushima going to ruin all of our savings that we've made? The answer is no. And the other question was, is nuclear now too expensive, given these new safety systems? And the answer to that is no. Nuclear power, actually, in Japan, is the cheapest electricity. Even today, it's the cheapest energy, given how much you need, how quickly it can deliver that energy to the nation. And also the other thing is that Japan is a little similar to the UK in that the weather is very changeable. So solar and wind-powered systems are okay, but you have a large storm, high winds, a lot of that infrastructure is damaged. So it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell to the Japanese people to say, like, I know Fukushima happened, I know we evacuated thousands of you, I know it's still a scar on the society at the moment, but actually you should stick with it from a numbers point of view. And that's my opinion on it, with an informed opinion, but, Any more? Maybe time for one more, unless... Yeah?
Just one question. You talk a lot about the documentation and the difficulty finding it. The location of the documentation play a part?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So if I very quickly go back to a picture of the site. Where are we? A good one. Yeah, no. Okay. So these are the reactor buildings, and the control room is inside the reactor building. To get in and out, it's a lengthy process. And during this time, they still had to go through the radiation gates and all of that stuff. So it's a while to do that. So what they had to do, they had to go from here. Then you had to walk up a relatively steep ramp, which is about 150, 200 meters. All while there's a lot of, there's aftershocks and there's stuff in the road, so you can't drive, you got to walk. And the administration building is here. And then you go into the administration building. The administration building wasn't isolated from the earthquake at all. So there's glass absolutely everywhere. It's, the wind is blown in, so all the documents are on the floor. So yes, they had to leaf through hundreds and hundreds of pages of this stuff. The other problem they had is that they lost electrical power and lighting in the control rooms, so they had to rely on head torches to try and find some of these emergency documents that they had. And the issue that was raised by the IAEA was that they should have had those systems and those maps on the computer system, and they did. You could just Google it. You'd have a search function for a particular document, but because they lost electrical power, they didn't have that, and they were criticized for not having a sort of battery-operated system to allow you to get to all of the manuals and documentation. Yeah, 10,000 pages, it's a big ask for anybody to look through. Okay, one last question.
Just on the difficulties that they face, given everything they have to overcome, and the fact that the reactor still exploded, did the people that stayed behind actually do anything productive, or if they just walked away with the same thing?
Okay, so yeah, sorry, the previous question was for me to comment a little bit more about the difficulty of the operators getting the documentation. The last question was if the operators just walked away, would exactly the same thing have happened? I think it's impossible to completely answer that. I think most likely the meltdowns would have occurred anyway. But the operators who were there, they were able to perform some low level of venting, which possibly could have reduced some of the hydrogen explosion magnitude. The other thing that they were able to keep feeding data back was when they did eventually get some temperature and pressure measurements, they were able to get them back. And that's very important to be able to feed back to the emergency disaster committee in Tokyo, who is trying to find out exactly what's going on and when. And one of the things is, when did it explode? What reactor was it? What was the fuel mixture that you were using? How much fuel did you have in the spent fuel pool? What's the direction of the wind from your local wind meters? All that stuff. So this Fukushima 50, if you Google Fukushima 50, it's a very interesting article to read about people who voluntarily stayed. And, you know, the information that they fed back was certainly useful. A lot of it was incorrect, they later found. But I think there is in Japan, there is a commitment to your job. And especially if you know that if you don't do absolutely everything that you can, that there could be more radiation released into your environment where you may well live, then you can understand why people would stay. But in terms of would it have melted down, yeah, you know, the moment that earthquake happened and the tsunami, it was basically game over. There was the magnitude of the accident could have been reduced, but not by a huge amount.
I think we're going to have to close there. That was a really interesting talk. You talked for over an hour, and you've taken a good solid 40 minutes of questions as well.
Oh, wow. I hope nobody's bored.
I think we've definitely all got our money's worth tonight.
Okay.
So can I just give Dr. Malkin one last round of applause? And thank you.
Since the 1940s, the UK has run many nuclear reactors for research, military purposes, and electricity generation. These reactors all use uranium as fuel, housed inside of a core made out of graphite blocks. This graphite core assists in the nuclear fission process, enabling a controllable chain reaction which provides a constant source of heat. This heat is then used to turn water into steam, which in turn drives turbines to produce electricity. Nuclear power plants, though, invariably create nuclear waste, and therefore when any reactor is shut down, the waste must be safely stored and contained. We then simply have to wait for it to stop being radioactive. However, this takes thousands to millions of years, making it a long-term safety and financial commitment to maintain and monitor. Because of our use of graphite-moderated reactors, the UK has created almost 95,000 tons of radioactively contaminated graphite blocks. This graphite is just one form of carbon, a common and stable element, but having placed these blocks in a high radioactivity environment, some of the carbon is altered by the nuclear energy, turning it into the radioactive isotope carbon-14. The carbon-14 will eventually turn back into normal carbon once its extra energy decays away, but this is a lengthy process, and the radioactivity of carbon-14 halves once every 5,730 years. Recently, scientists from the University of Bristol's Cabot Institute have demonstrated that the radioactive carbon-14 is concentrated on the outside surfaces of our graphite blocks, meaning that it is possible to process them to remove a lot of this radioactivity. By heating them, much of the radioactive carbon is given off as a gas, which is then collected. The remaining graphite blocks are still radioactive, just less so, meaning that they're less of a problem and less of a cost to deal with. The radioactive carbon-14 in gas form can then be converted at low pressures and elevated temperatures to form a diamond, which is just another form of carbon. These small man-made diamonds have a strange property in that they can generate an electrical current when placed within a radioactive field. Our diamonds, though, are made of radioactive carbon and so are able to provide their own energy to generate a small electrical current. This gives us a nuclear-powered diamond battery. For this to be used safely, though, another non-radioactive diamond layer is formed around the radioactive diamond, completely absorbing all of the dangerous radiation and converting it into even more electricity, making it near 100% efficient. There are no moving parts, no emissions, and no maintenance, just direct electricity generation. And since diamond is the hardest substance known to man, no other material could easily offer any more protection to the radioactive carbon-14. On the outside, only a tiny amount of radiation can be detected, but this is less than what a single banana emits, making it perfectly safe to handle. As we mentioned, the radioactivity of carbon-14 halves every 5,730 years, meaning our diamond batteries have an incredible lifetime. They would only reach 50% power in the year 7746. These diamond batteries would therefore best be used in situations where it's not feasible to charge or replace conventional batteries, such as in satellites and space exploration, or use in implantable devices, such as pacemakers. In fact, there are so many possible applications that we're asking the public to make their own suggestions using the hashtag #DiamondBattery. The development of this new technology solves some of the problems of nuclear waste, clean electricity generation and battery life, truly taking us into the diamond age of power generation.
The course is designed to bring the very best scientists and engineers as undergraduates onto a course where they're trained about the fundamentals of nuclear science and engineering, and at the same time they're taught to work as part of a multidisciplinary team specifically for problem solving for the nuclear industry.
This course will be appealing predominantly to physicists and engineers, but because of its general nature, it should be appealing to all of the sciences really, and this is the catchment that we're trying to get.
Bristol has an extremely well-recognised international reputation for physics and for science research and engineering in general. We have a long-standing track record of nuclear research over the last 25 years, and in 2013 we were ranked by the UK government as the best university for nuclear research in the UK.
The core structure of the MSc involves 5 taught lecture units, and those will comprise lectures on nuclear reactor engineering and nuclear reactor physics. So this is how you build and design a reactor, and then how you operate the reactor. Then there are 2 other core units, one on the nuclear fuel cycles, and then we look at nuclear materials behaviour, how materials behave in terms of the structural properties that you're using for the integrity of the nuclear reactor all the way through to the fuel itself. And there'll be a lecture course on the fundamentals of nuclear fission, fusion and radioactivity.
We're really fortunate that we have a multi-million-pound array of analytical equipment specifically for looking at materials and nuclear materials.
In engineering, we have a number of leading facilities that the students can use. For example, the shaking table. We do experiments on it of a quarter mock-up of a nuclear power plant core in there to study what happens if an earthquake hits the power plant. We have creep lab, we have residual stress measurement lab, we have fatigue and fracture, and we have corrosion lab.
We're very interested in developing device technologies to measure radiation in an environment, and we then have to develop a platform to deliver the device into the right place.
So we were assigned a research project by Tom Scott, working with Sellafield to produce a device which is able to map radiation levels in a pipe at Sellafield. The device is a pipe crawler. It had to be small enough to fit inside these pipes at Sellafield. It had to have a spectrometer to measure radiation levels, and it also needed to have a location system so it knows where it is within these pipes.
By working very closely with the nuclear companies, they're very keen to recruit the best possible graduates. And so there's very good opportunities for onwards employment by studying with us on the Nuclear Masters.
It's nice to have that sort of additional drive that you can see that you're giving back to industry and you're actually working on projects that they are interested in and they need to find the answers for. Not only do you get the experience of academia and what it might be like to progress along the academic route, but also you get such good close contact with industry. So it gives you the opportunity to see what it might be like to go down both of those career paths, and you can make a more informed decision of what's the best route for you.
It's a range of skills that we're interested in, from apprenticeships right through to high-end skills in technical, engineering and scientific subjects. It's this combination of academic excellence and industrial focus which really helps to drive the innovation that we need to support the future of the civil nuclear industry.
The students will be very lucky. They'll be housed in their very own nuclear research building alongside academics, alongside PhD students in the heart of the city, which is a very green city, formerly the European Green Capital. The students really couldn't wish for any more in terms of their surroundings. but also the quality of teaching and the resources available.